My name is Claire Whitfield, and for 12 years I ran my family's furniture company from a desk with no title on the door, while my younger brother sat 2 offices down collecting the credit for work I'd already finished before he ever walked into the room. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's the whole shape of my life in one sentence. I wasn't fired. I wasn't pushed out. I was simply never given the thing I'd earned over and over for 12 years, while everyone around me smiled and called it fair. Then my father died, and I found out he'd spent the last 3 years of his life quietly building a case, a paper trail, hidden in a locked filing cabinet only I had the key to understand, proving something none of us were ready to hear about, where the company's money had actually been going, and who had actually been taking it. What I found in that cabinet didn't just change who owned Whitfield Furniture. It ended my brother's career. It nearly ended my mother's second marriage, to her own denial. And it finally, after 39 years, gave me proof of something I'd stopped believing was true: that my father had seen exactly who I was the entire time, even when he never once said it out loud. Let me start from the beginning, because I think you need to understand what invisible actually looks like from the inside before you understand what it took to stop being that. My father, Walter Whitfield, built Whitfield Furniture from a single workshop in 1974 into a regional company with 3 showrooms and a manufacturing facility that employed almost 200 people. He was, by every account, a brilliant craftsman and a decent boss. And he was also, in the particular way of men from his generation, a father who believed sons carried the family name forward, and daughters supported the effort from somewhere just off to the side. I don't think he ever said that sentence out loud. He didn't have to. It was baked into every decision he made from the moment my brother, Preston, was born, 3 years after me, and suddenly became the center of gravity around which the rest of our family quietly organized itself. I was good at math from an early age, the kind of good that teachers pull aside and mention to parents, the kind that gets you into advanced placement classes without trying very hard. Preston was good at talking, at charm, at walking into a room and making people feel like the conversation had been waiting for him to arrive. My mother, Diane, adored that quality in him with a devotion that bordered on worship, and I think, looking back, she saw in Preston a kind of social ease she'd never had herself, and loved him partly for representing a version of confidence she'd always wanted herself. Me, she loved too, in her way, but it was a quieter, more conditional kind of love, the kind that showed up when I brought home good grades, and mostly went quiet the rest of the time, the way background noise does when you stop paying attention to it. I still remember, with the specific clarity childhood humiliations tend to have, the year I was 14 and won the state mathletics championship, the kind of thing that should have earned at least a mention at dinner. My mother attended the awards ceremony, but she left before they called my name, because Preston, 11 at the time, had a little league game across town that started 20 minutes later, and in her words, somebody had to be there for his big moment, and yours already happened, didn't it? I remember standing on that stage at 14, scanning the half-empty auditorium for a face that wasn't there, and understanding something about my place in this family that I wouldn't have the language for until I was well into my 30s. My father was there, at least. He'd come straight from the workshop, sawdust still on his shirt, and he took me to Pi afterward, where he asked me to explain the winning problem to him twice, in detail, because he said he wanted to actually understand it, not just nod along the way most people did with things they didn't care to follow. I joined the company right out of college with an accounting degree, starting in the bookkeeping department because, as my father put it at the time, it's good to learn the business from the ground up. I believed him. I was 22 and eager, and I genuinely thought ground up meant something different than what it turned out to mean for me specifically, because Preston joined the company 2 years later, straight into a junior management position, no ground floor required.
I worked my way up anyway, the slow, unglamorous way, through payroll, through vendor contracts, through learning the manufacturing side well enough that the plant foreman started calling me directly with problems instead of going through official channels, because they knew I'd actually solve them, instead of scheduling a meeting about scheduling a meeting. By the time I was 30, I was functionally running half the company's operations, though my title, Senior Operations Coordinator, never quite caught up to what the job actually was. Preston, in that same span of years, became Vice President of Business Development. I want to be fair to him because I've spent a long time being unfair to him in my head, and I don't want to keep doing that here. He wasn't incompetent. He was charming with clients, decent at closing new accounts, comfortable in rooms that made me anxious. But the actual mechanics of the business, the budgets, the supply chain, the quarterly numbers that determined whether 200 employees kept their jobs, those ran through me. Preston presented the numbers, I built them. There was a specific meeting about 8 years ago that I've never quite been able to forget. We were pitching a major retail partnership, the kind of deal that would have doubled our distribution overnight, and I'd spent 6 weeks building the financial model that made the case. Preston presented it. He did it well, I'll give him that. He had a gift for making numbers sound like a story worth believing in. At the end, the retail partner's lead negotiator shook Preston's hand and said, "This is exactly the kind of sharp financial thinking we need in a partner." Preston said thank you. He didn't correct her. He didn't so much as glance my way, sitting 3 seats down at the same table, where I'd spent the entire meeting fielding the technical questions Preston couldn't answer himself. I remember driving home that night and crying in my car in the driveway for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside, not because the deal had gone badly, it hadn't, it went beautifully, but because I understood with a clarity I hadn't let myself have before that I could keep doing exactly this for the rest of my career and nothing about the credit would ever redistribute itself, not unless something forced it to. There was a second incident about a year after that compounded the first one in a way I've never quite been able to shake. The company was up for a regional business award, Family Business of the Year, sponsored by the local Chamber of Commerce, and my father asked Preston to accept it on behalf of the company, since Preston was better in front of a crowd. I'd written the entire nomination packet myself, 3 weeks of evenings spent documenting the company's growth, its community involvement, the specific operational improvements I'd personally implemented that made us competitive enough to even be considered. I sat in the audience that night in a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion and watched my brother walk on stage to accept an award for a version of the company's success story that was, in every specific detail, actually mine. He thanked my father, he thanked the sales team, he thanked generically everyone who makes this company what it is. He did not once look toward the table where I was sitting. I don't think it occurred to him. That, I think, is the part that stayed with me longest. Not malice exactly, just a total, unexamined assumption that credit simply flowed toward him by default, the way water finds the lowest point in a room without ever having to think about where it's going. At home, the pattern repeated in smaller, more personal ways. Preston's divorce, 4 years ago, became a family crisis my mother managed with the intensity of a natural disaster response. Daily phone calls, an intervention-style dinner, a genuine outpouring of concern that lasted months. My own divorce, 2 years before that, got a single, slightly awkward conversation at Thanksgiving and a comment from my mother about how some people just aren't cut out for marriage, delivered in a tone that made clear which category she'd already filed me under.
There were smaller moments, too, scattered across the years, the kind that don't sound like much individually, but accumulate into something heavier over time. The Christmas Preston forgot to buy anyone gifts, and my mother laughed it off as him just being so busy with important things. The year I organized our father's 60th birthday party single-handedly. The venue, the guest list, the catering, the toast I wrote, and then quietly handed to Preston to deliver because my mother suggested, without any apparent irony, that it would mean more coming from him, and watched him receive compliments all night for an event I'd built from nothing. The countless family dinners where my accomplishments got a polite nod before the conversation pivoted, almost by reflex, back to whatever Preston had going on, as though my life were an intermission between the more interesting parts of the evening. I don't say any of this to make you feel sorry for me exactly. I say it because I think a lot of people watching this know exactly what I'm describing, that particular, hard-to-name exhaustion of being competent and reliable and constantly, quietly overlooked, while someone else in your family gets celebrated for doing less more visibly. It's not a dramatic kind of pain. It doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates year after year until one day you look up and realize you've spent your whole adult life auditioning for a role you were never actually going to be cast in. My father got sick 18 months ago, pancreatic cancer, the same brutal diagnosis that doesn't leave much room for hope. And I watched a man who'd built an entire company through sheer force of will slowly lose the ability to walk to his own mailbox. I took a leave of absence I never officially requested, splitting my days between running operations remotely and sitting with him through appointments my mother found too difficult to attend consistently. Preston visited when he could, which was less often than he told people it was. Those months taught me things about my father I never would have learned any other way. The kind of things you only find out when you're the one sitting through the long, quiet afternoons, not the brief, cheerful Sunday visit. I learned he'd kept a small notebook for years, tucked in his workshop, full of sketches for furniture designs he'd never had time to build, ideas he'd apparently been saving for a retirement he now wasn't going to get. I learned he'd been quietly covering the medical bills of a long-time employee's wife for over a year without ever mentioning it to anyone, because, in his words, the one time I asked him about it directly, the kind of help people talk about isn't really help, it's a performance for whoever's watching. I learned mostly what it felt like to actually be paid attention to by him in a sustained way I hadn't experienced since I was a teenager eating pie after a math competition. There was an afternoon in early autumn, one of the better days, when the pain medication had worn off just enough for real conversation, when he asked me, apropos of nothing, to tell him about a project I was working on at the plant. Not the summary I usually gave him, but the actual details, the specific decisions and trade-offs. I remember being surprised by how long he listened, how many follow-up questions he asked, how present he seemed for all 40 minutes of it. I didn't understand at the time that he was doing something closer to due diligence than casual conversation. I understand it now. There was one afternoon, about 4 months before he died, when my father was lucid enough for a real conversation, one of the last we'd have like that. He asked me, out of nowhere, whether I was happy with how things had turned out at the company. I remember being so unused to the question, from him specifically, that I didn't know how to answer honestly at first. "I don't know," I finally said. "I think I stopped asking myself that a long time ago." He was quiet for a long moment, and something in his face had gone very still. "I need you to start asking again, soon. It's going to matter more than you think." I didn't understand what he meant. I filed it away as one more strange thing sick people sometimes say, medication and exhaustion blurring the edges of ordinary conversation. I had no idea that afternoon just how deliberately he'd chosen those words, or how much he'd already put in motion behind the scenes without telling anyone. My father died on a Sunday morning in late autumn, with my hand in his, 3 weeks after that conversation.
Preston made it to the hospital 40 minutes after he passed. I've never once brought that up to him directly, and I probably never will, but I notice it, the way I notice most things nobody else seems to. The funeral drew nearly the entire company, which told you something about the kind of man he'd actually been, whatever his blind spots at home. The reading of the will 2 weeks later was smaller, my mother, Preston, and me, in the office of our longtime family attorney, a sharp, careful woman named Renata Ochoa, who'd handled Whitefield Furniture's legal affairs for almost 20 years. I want to tell you I walked into that room expecting anything different than I'd always expected. I didn't. I assumed, the way you assume things you've had 39 years of evidence for, that the company would go to Preston, that I would receive some respectful secondary provision, and that I'd nod along the way I always had, because that's what the daughter who just did the books did. Renata began reading in her usual measured tone, the kind that made even routine provisions sound weighted with significance. To my wife, Diane, I leave our home on Larkwood Avenue, along with a trust sufficient to maintain her standard of living for the remainder of her life. My mother nodded slightly, unsurprised. To my son, Preston, I leave my personal tools, my 1987 pickup truck, a selection of items detailed in the attached schedule, and a 15% ownership stake in Whitefield Furniture Incorporated. I watched Preston's shoulders relax slightly at that. 15%, a comfortable number, a number that still left plenty of room, in his mind, for whatever larger role he assumed was coming next in the reading. I sat very still, waiting for my portion to be announced, already composing in my head the gracious response I'd give to whatever smaller allotment was coming. The controlling ownership of Whitefield Furniture, 85%, along with the position of Chief Executive Officer, is left in full to Claire Whitefield. The room went very quiet. I remember looking around, half convinced I'd misheard, and finding Preston's face frozen in an expression I'd genuinely never seen him on before. Not anger yet, just pure, uncomprehending shock. The look of a man watching a script he'd never questioned suddenly failing to follow itself. "That can't be right," my mother said, her voice tight. "Walter would never have— Preston has been vice president for over a decade. He's the one who—" "I'm simply reading what your husband instructed," Renata said, carefully, professionally, though I caught something in her eyes that told me she'd been expecting exactly this reaction. "There's an additional item. Mr. Whitefield left a personal letter and a set of instructions specifically for Claire, to be delivered separately outside this meeting. He was quite specific that she review it alone before any further conversation about the company's direction." Preston found his voice first. "This is insane. Claire does the books. I'm the one who's built the client relationships, the growth strategy, the— Mom, tell her this is insane." My mother didn't tell me anything. She just stared at me with an expression I'd spent my whole life trying to earn something other than, and for one strange, vertiginal moment, I didn't know whether what I felt was vindication or dread. Possibly both, tangled together in a way I wouldn't fully untangle for months. I drove to the house on Larkwood Avenue, my parents' house, my mother's house now, technically, though I still thought of it as theirs, the following evening, letter in hand, unopened because Renata was clear that my father wanted me to read it in private, somewhere that was mine. I ended up reading it in my car in my own driveway, the same spot where I'd cried after that retail meeting 8 years earlier, which felt in a way I couldn't quite explain, like the right kind of symmetry. The letter came with a small brass key taped to the inside flap of the envelope. "My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, then I've run out of time to say most of what's in this letter to your face, and I regret that more than almost anything else about how the last year of my life has gone. I want to start by telling you something I should have said out loud a long time ago, instead of only ever showing it through actions you had every right to miss because I was too much of a coward about my own family to say it plainly. You built this company as much as I did, more in the last decade. I have known that for years, and I let you go on believing otherwise, and I am sorry for that in a way that I don't think this letter can fully hold.
I had to stop reading for several minutes, sitting there in my car before I could continue. The key attached to this letter opens the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in my study, the old gray one you always teased me for never replacing. Inside, you will find 3 years of documentation I have been quietly assembling, mostly on my own, occasionally with the help of an outside forensic accountant I hired without telling anyone, including your mother, specifically because I did not trust that the truth would stay contained if too many people knew I was looking for it. I felt something cold move through me before I'd even finished the sentence. Claire, I need you to understand that I did not go looking for what I found. I went looking, initially, because our margins had been shrinking in a way that didn't match our sales figures. And you know, as well as I do, that numbers which don't add up are rarely an accident once you dig deep enough. What I found instead was worse than a shrinking margin. I found your brother. I sat in my driveway for a long time after that line, engine off, letter shaking slightly in my hands, understanding before I'd even opened the cabinet, before I'd seen a single page of evidence, that whatever came next was going to change every remaining relationship I had left in this family. If this story is already making you think about someone in your own life who did the real work while someone else took the credit, you're not alone, and this is exactly the kind of story we tell here. Consider subscribing to Silent Victory Stories so you don't miss where this goes. I didn't sleep that night. I drove back to Larkwood Avenue at nearly 11, let myself into my father's darkened study with the small brass key still warm from being held too tightly in my palm for 2 hours, and opened the bottom drawer of that old gray filing cabinet he'd never once replaced, no matter how many times I'd offered him to buy him a nicer one for his birthday. Inside were folders, organized with the same meticulous precision he'd brought to every financial decision he'd ever made in his life. Bank statements, vendor invoices, tabbed and cross-referenced by date, a forensic accountant's formal report dated 11 months earlier, bearing a letterhead I didn't recognize, and a conclusion that made my stomach drop before I'd even finished the executive summary. I remember the particular quiet of that study at 11 at night, the only sound the old grandfather clock in the hallway ticking through the seconds while I turned page after page of my father's careful, methodical unraveling of something none of us had ever been meant to see. There was a moment, maybe 20 minutes in, when I heard a car pass slowly on the street outside, and my whole body went rigid, some instinctive, irrational fear that Preston himself might somehow already know what I'd found and had come to stop me. It was nothing, of course, just a neighbor's car turning into their own driveway. But I remember sitting there afterward, heart still pounding, understanding for the first time just how much this discovery had already changed the shape of my own nervous system, even before I'd decided what to do about it. Over the course of nearly 6 years, Preston had been approving payments to a vendor called Harmon Logistics Solutions for freight and distribution services that, according to the forensic accountant's investigation, had either never been performed or had been dramatically overbilled relative to comparable market rates. Harmon Logistics Solutions, it turned out, was registered to an address that traced back, through 2 shell layers, the same patient unraveling my father had apparently taught himself to do out of sheer necessity, to a company owned by Preston's college roommate, a man named Curtis Reyes, who I vaguely remembered from a handful of holiday parties over the years.
The total, over 6 years, came to just over $840,000 in inflated and fabricated invoices. Some portion of that, the forensic report noted carefully, appeared to have been returned to Preston through a separate arrangement involving Curtis's company covering, quietly, a series of Preston's personal expenses, the down payment on his lake house, 2 years of his daughter's private school tuition, a debt from his divorce settlement that had mysteriously resolved itself faster than anyone in the family understood at the time. I sat in the floor of my father's study for what felt like hours, going through page after page, watching 6 years of my brother's quiet theft laid out in the same careful handwriting my father had used to sign my birthday cards. There was a note, handwritten, clipped to the front of the forensic report. I confirmed this 11 months ago, and I have told no one, including your mother, because I needed time to understand what I was going to do about it, and because, I will be honest with you, Claire, since I owe you nothing less than complete honesty in this letter, I was afraid. Afraid of what confronting Preston directly would do to what remained of our family. Afraid of what it would do to your mother, who I think suspected something was wrong longer than she ever admitted to either of us, and chose, the way she has chosen most difficult things in her life, not to look closely enough to have to act on it. That line stopped me cold. I read it 3 times before I let myself fully understand what it meant. I don't say that to excuse her, Claire. I say it because I think you deserve to know, going into whatever comes next, that you were never the only one in this family who noticed things nobody wanted to talk about. You were simply the one who kept doing the right thing anyway, quietly, for years, without ever once being asked to do it. I decided in the end that I could not undo 6 years of theft and $840,000 through a single confrontation before I died. That kind of reckoning needed someone who would still be here afterward to see it through properly, with a clear head and the actual authority to act on it. That is why the company is yours, Claire, not as an apology, though it is partly that, as a correction. The company was always, in every way that mattered, already yours. I am simply making the paperwork finally agree with reality. I have left the choice of what to do with this information entirely in your hands. You can pursue this legally. The forensic report and everything in this cabinet would almost certainly support both a civil case for recovery and, depending on what the district attorney's office decides, potential criminal charges. You can handle it privately, some negotiated resolution that keeps this out of court and out of the community's knowledge of our family. Or you can decide, for reasons entirely your own, not to pursue restitution at all, and simply use your ownership to make sure nothing like this can ever happen again. I trust you to make whatever choice actually lets you sleep at night, because I think, of everyone in this family, you have always been the one who understood the difference between what's easy and what's right. I love you completely, Claire, and without qualification, which I know is more than I ever managed to show you clearly while I was alive. I hope this gives you back some fraction of what this family owed you and never paid. Always your father, Walter. I don't fully remember driving home that night. I remember sitting at my own kitchen table until nearly 4 in the morning, the forensic report spread out in front of me, replaying 6 years of family dinners and holiday gatherings through this new, ugly lens. Preston's lake house, the one he'd always described as a stretch he'd made work through smart budgeting. His daughter's private school, which my mother bragged about constantly as evidence of what a wonderful provider he'd become. His divorce settlement he resolved so much faster than his lawyer friends had predicted at the time, a fact he'd credited at the time to just being reasonable with Denise. I thought, too, about my father sitting across from Preston at those same gatherings for the last 11 months of his life, knowing exactly what his son had done and saying nothing, Not out of weakness, I understood now, but out of the same patient, deliberate restraint he'd apparently decided near the end of his life only I would be equipped to finish. I understood, sitting there in the dark, exactly how much that kind of silence must have cost him. It isn't passivity, it's the hardest kind of restraint there is, and I recognized it because I'd been practicing an amateur version of it my entire adult life without ever fully understanding what it was building towards. By the time the sun came up, something in me had settled into a colder, steadier resolve. I wasn't going to march into the office and start shouting. I was going to do exactly what my father had modeled for me, without explaining the lesson out loud. I was going to be patient and thorough, and I was going to make absolutely certain that when this finally came out, nobody would be able to argue with a single piece of it.
There was a week, right in the middle of those 6 weeks, when I nearly told someone before I was ready. My closest friend at the company, a plant manager named Denise Okafor, who'd worked alongside me for almost a decade and had never once needed to be told twice how to solve a problem, noticed something was wrong almost immediately. I've never been especially good at hiding things from people who actually pay attention. We were reviewing production schedules late one evening, and I nearly told her everything. The letter, the cabinet, the $841,000 sitting right there in my chest like something too heavy to keep carrying alone. What stopped me wasn't loyalty to some plan I hadn't fully formed yet. It was a smaller, more practical fear that if I said it out loud before the forensic accountant had finished the updated investigation, before Renata had everything structured correctly, I'd lose the careful, methodical footing my father had built for me and react instead from raw anger, which was closer to the surface than I wanted to admit even to myself. So I told Denise only that I was dealing with some complicated estate matters and asked for patience. She gave it to me without a single follow-up question, which is exactly the kind of quiet trustworthiness that made me, 6 months later, one of the people I promoted into a senior management role, a decision that had nothing to do with this story and everything to do with the kind of company I wanted to build once I finally had the authority to build it. There was a moment, about 4 weeks into that 6-week window, that nearly forced my hand earlier than I'd planned. Preston stopped by my office unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming all-hands meeting, but I could tell within the first minute that something else was actually on his mind. "I heard you had a meeting with an accountant last week," he said, trying to sound casual and not quite managing it. "Someone from outside the company. Everything okay with the transition?" I felt my pulse spike, though I don't think it showed on my face. 12 years of sitting through meetings where I had to look composed while doing the actual mental math nobody else in the room could follow had trained me well for exactly this moment. "Just making sure the books are clean before I officially take over as CEO," I said. "Standard due diligence. You do the same thing in my position." He studied me for a moment longer than felt comfortable, and I understood, watching him, that some instinct in him already suspected the ground beneath his feet had shifted, even if he couldn't yet name why. "Of course," he finally said. "Makes sense. Let me know if you need anything from my end." He left, and I sat at my desk afterward with my heart still pounding, understanding that I no longer had the luxury of the slow, careful timeline I'd originally planned. If he'd noticed the accountant, it meant he might start covering tracks, might reach out to Curtis to align their stories, might do any number of things that would make the clean, undeniable case my father had built considerably messier by the time I was ready to use it. I called Renata that same evening and asked her how quickly we could move. She told me the fastest way was also the most direct one: finalize the updated forensic report within the week and have the confrontation before Preston had time to organize any kind of defense, which meant the careful, deliberate pacing I'd imagined for myself compressed suddenly into a much shorter window, days instead of weeks,
a decision I now had to make faster than I felt entirely ready for. I spent the next 6 weeks doing 3 things at once: legally establishing myself as CEO with Renata's help, quietly retaining the same forensic accountant my father had hired to update the investigation through the present date, and preparing, methodically, for a conversation I knew I could no longer avoid. There was a company all-hands meeting scheduled for early December, the first with me formally at the helm, and I decided that whatever happened with Preston needed to happen before that meeting, not after. I wasn't going to stand in front of 200 employees representing a company I now knew had been quietly bled for 6 years without at least having confronted the person responsible. I asked Preston to meet me at the Larkwood Avenue house, not the office, on a Wednesday evening. I told him I wanted to talk about how we move forward as co-owners, which was true in the narrowest possible sense, and which I knew would make him comfortable enough to come without his guard fully up. He arrived confident, almost breezy, clearly spending the 6 weeks since the will reading talking himself into believing this was all some kind of temporary oversight that reasonable siblings would sort out privately. He made a joke about corporate restructuring before he'd even sat down. I let him get halfway through a glass of wine before I set the forensic report on the table between us, open to the page listing Harmon Logistics Solutions, and the total, $841,600. I watched every trace of that easy confidence drain from his face in real time. "Claire, I can explain. You've been stealing from Dad's company for 6 years, I said, and I kept my voice level because I'd practiced this conversation more times in my head than I'll ever admit to anyone. Using Curtis's company as a pass-through, Dad found it 11 months ago, he documented all of it before he died, and he left it to me to decide what happens next." He didn't deny it. That surprised me more than I expected it to. Some part of me had braced for him to lie outright, to twist the numbers, to make it my fault somehow for not understanding the complexities of vendor relationships, which is almost word for word what he actually said about 30 seconds ago once the shock had worn off enough for him to start performing an explanation. It wasn't stealing exactly. Curtis's company did provide real services, some of them. The numbers just got inflated over time, and I understand how that looks, but I was going to make it right eventually. I just needed 6 years, Preston. Your daughter's tuition, your lake house down payment, your divorce settlement. That's not an accounting error that got away from you. That's a plan executed patiently for a very long time by someone who assumed nobody was paying close enough to attention. "You don't understand the pressure I was under," he said, and something in his voice shifted, defensive now instead of merely startled. "Everyone always expected so much from me, the VP title, the client relationships. Do you have any idea what it's like to have that kind of expectation on you every single day?" I actually laughed at that, a short, disbelieving sound I hadn't planned. "I built the numbers that made you look good in every single one of those client meetings for 12 years, Preston. I know exactly what pressure looks like. I just never had the luxury of solving it by stealing $841,000 from our father's company." He flinched at that, and for a moment I thought he might actually apologize, might say something real instead of another practiced justification. He didn't. Instead, he asked, quietly, "Does Mom know?" He didn't have an answer for the rest of it. I watched him look down at the report again, at the 6 years of dates and figures laid out in careful forensic accountant language, and something in his shoulders finally sagged, like a man understanding all at once that there was no version of this conversation where he came out looking like anything other than exactly what he was. "Does Mom know?" he finally asked again, and his voice had gone smaller than I'd heard him since we were children. "Not yet," I said. "That's going to be its own conversation, and I'm not doing it for you. But she's going to know, Preston, soon." He asked me, begged me in a way that made me feel something uncomfortably close to pity, tangled together with an anger I hadn't fully let myself feel until that exact moment. Not to pursue anything legally. He offered, in increasingly desperate terms, to pay back what he could over time, to sign whatever ownership adjustment I wanted, to do literally anything except involve the district attorney's office or let this become public within the industry. I told him I hadn't yet decided what I was going to do. That was true. My father's letter had given me the choice deliberately, and I'd spent 6 weeks turning it over without landing anywhere solid. What I told him in that moment was simpler and, I think, more useful to both of us than a decision I wasn't ready to make yet. I'm not deciding tonight, but I need you to understand something clearly, whatever I end up choosing. The company is mine now, not because Dad felt sorry for me, because I'm the one who actually held it together for 12 years while you took credit for it, and because when it mattered most, I'm the one he trusted to find the truth and do something honest with it. That's not going to change no matter what happens next between us. I told my mother 2 days later, at her kitchen table, the same table where I'd spent 39 years learning exactly how conditional her attention could be. I watched her go through nearly every stage of disbelief in the span of 20 minutes, first insisting there had to be some mistake, some reasonable explanation Preston simply hadn't had the chance to give yet, and then, slowly, painfully falling quiet as I laid the documentation out in front of her, page by page, the same way my father must have once laid it out for himself, alone, working up the courage to decide what to do about it.
I think some part of me always wondered, she finally said, staring down at her own hands, about the lake house, about how quickly the divorce settled. I told myself I was being paranoid, imagining problems that weren't there, because looking too closely would have meant asking questions I didn't want the answers to. I know, I said, and I did know. That was, in some ways, the whole shape of what my father had built, without ever fully explaining it to any of us while he was alive. Not a trap for anyone specific, a slow, patient test of who would actually look closely and who wouldn't bother. She was quiet for a long time, turning a coffee mug slowly between her hands, not drinking from it. "Can I ask you something?" she finally said, "and I want an honest answer, not a kind one." "Okay." Did some part of you enjoy this, finally being the one who was right about all of it, about Preston, about how things were divided in this family? I made myself actually sit with that question instead of giving her the easy denial. For about an hour, the night I read Dad's letter, I admitted. I won't pretend some small, ugly part of me didn't feel something like vindication, imagining this exact conversation. But mostly what I feel, sitting here right now, is tired, Mom. Tired of being the one who has to be the reasonable one. Tired of being overlooked my whole life, and then finding out the one time it actually mattered, being overlooked was the only reason I was ever in a position to catch this at all. That's not really a victory, it's just exhausting. I spent your whole life telling myself I loved you both the same, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't think that was ever true. I think I was so drawn to how easy Preston made everything look that I never noticed how much harder you were quietly working to make it look easy for him. I never once stopped to ask whether that was fair to you. I'm asking now, I suppose, 39 years too late. I didn't tell her it was fine. I'd spent most of my life telling people things were fine when they weren't, and I'd promised myself, sitting in my father's study with that letter in my hands, that I was done doing that. It wasn't fair, I said, but I'd rather you finally see it now than never. She cried at that kitchen table in a way I don't think I'd ever seen her cry before, not even at the funeral. It wasn't a fix. One afternoon of honesty doesn't undo 39 years of a particular, comfortable kind of blindness,
but it was a start, and I've come to believe that starts are worth considerably more than we usually give them credit for. The all-hands meeting in early December arrived 3 days after my confrontation with Preston, and I stood in front of nearly 200 employees, machine operators, upholsterers, delivery drivers, the sales team I'd spent 12 years quietly supporting from behind the scenes, and introduced myself as CEO for the first time in a room that size. I hadn't prepared much of a speech. I'd spent so many years being the person who wrote other people's remarks that writing my own, in my own voice, felt almost unfamiliar. I told them the truth, in the broad strokes I was able to share at that point, that ownership had passed to me, that I intended to keep building the company my father started, that changes were coming to how we handled financial oversight, changes I believed would make the company stronger and more transparent for everyone who depended on it. I didn't mention Preston by name. I didn't need to. Word travels through a company of 200 people whether you intend it to or not, and by the following week, most of the plant already seemed to understand, in vague outline, that something significant had shifted. What surprised me most was the response afterwards. A line of employees, some I recognized instantly and some I'd only ever seen in passing on the plant floor, stopping to shake my hand, several of them saying variations of the same thing. "We always knew you were the one actually running things." I hadn't realized until that afternoon, standing in a conference room shaking dozens of hands, just how many people had been quietly noticing all along, even while my own family hadn't. Denise found me afterwards, once the room had mostly cleared. "You looked terrified up there," she said, not unkindly. "I was," I admitted. "You didn't look it, for what it's worth." I decided in the end not to pursue criminal charges against Preston. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. I want to be honest about that because I think the neat, tidy version of this story would have me arrive at some full reconciliation, and that isn't quite what happened. It was closer to a decision about what kind of company and what kind of person I wanted to be on the other side of all this. I sat with Renata in her office for nearly 3 hours the week after I told my mother, working through the options methodically, the way my father would have wanted it handled. She laid out the realistic paths clearly: a criminal referral, which would almost certainly succeed given the strength of the documentation, but would also mean depositions, a public trial, our family's name and our father's legacy dragged through a courtroom, and, inevitably, the local business press. A private civil suit, which would recover the money, but still risk becoming public through court filings, or a negotiated settlement, structured entirely outside the court system, that would recover the funds, remove Preston from any position of authority, and keep the matter contained to the people who already knew. "There's no version of this that feels fully satisfying," Renata told me, not unkindly. "Whatever you choose, some part of you is going to wonder about the road not taken. I've seen enough of these situations to tell you that much honestly." I thought about my father's letter, about the line where he'd said he trusted me to make whatever choice actually let me sleep at night. I thought about the 200 employees whose paychecks depended on the company's reputation staying intact, people who had nothing to do with what Preston did and everything to lose if it became a scandal. And I thought, finally, about what kind of legacy I actually wanted to build with the company that was now undeniably mine. "Settlement," I told her. "Full repayment over 5 years, secured against his ownership stake in the company, along with his formal resignation from any executive role and the surrender of his remaining shares back to the company once the repayment was complete." I structured a legal settlement instead, with Renata's help, full repayment of $841,000 over 5 years, secured against his ownership stake in the company, along with his formal resignation from any executive role and the surrender of his remaining shares back to the company once the repayment was complete. Curtis Reyes's company was cut off entirely, and I referred that portion of the matter to our new outside counsel to handle separately, since whatever grace I was extending to my brother, I didn't feel the same obligation towards a stranger who'd knowingly helped him do it. Curtis, as it turned out, settled quickly and quietly once he understood the documentation my father had assembled, apparently unwilling to risk his own business's reputation over a scheme that had never been his idea to begin with, whatever his willingness to profit from it. Preston and I don't have the relationship we had before, which I've come to understand wasn't really much of a relationship at all, more of a set of assumptions about how our family worked that neither of us had ever examined closely. We speak occasionally, carefully, mostly about my mother's health or the logistics of holidays that have gotten considerably smaller and quieter since the 2 years since then. I don't know if that changes. I've stopped needing it to in order to feel like my own life is complete. The company itself has changed more than I expected it to. I brought in a real financial control system within my first year as CEO, the kind of oversight that should have existed years earlier and simply never had, because my father, for all his brilliance, had run the business for decades on trust alone. And trust, it turns out, is not the same thing as a system. I brought in 3 people from the manufacturing floor into management roles, people who'd been doing exceptional work for years without anyone thinking to ask what might be capable of with a little more authority and a little more trust, a decision that, I'll admit, felt personal in a way I didn't examine too closely at the time. One of these 3 was a woman named Marisol Ferrer, who'd run the upholstery line for 11 years with a level of precision that had quietly saved the company from 3 separate quality control disasters, none of which anyone above her had ever formally acknowledged. When I told her I was promoting her to plant operations director, she looked at me for a long moment before asking carefully, "Are you sure? I've never had the title before. I just did the work." I know exactly what that feels like. That's precisely why I'm sure. She cried a little, standing there in the hallway outside my office, and I found myself unexpectedly moved by it, understanding in a way I hadn't quite let myself before just how many Marisols there probably were scattered throughout companies everywhere, doing the real work from a desk or a station with no title attached to it, waiting for someone above them to finally notice.
We opened a 4th showroom last spring. I put my father's name on it, in smaller letters than the company's, exactly the way he would have wanted it. A man who never needed the credit as long as the thing itself was built well. My mother came to the opening, standing near the back during my brief remarks, and afterward she found me by the door and said, quietly, "He would have been proud of this, of you." I don't think I ever told him often enough that I thought so too, but I think he already knew, somehow, in a way I never quite managed. "He knew," I said. "He told me, near the end. I think that's part of why he did what he did." My mother comes by the office sometimes now, which she never once did while my father was alive. She asks real questions about how things are going, waits for the actual answer instead of already thinking about what she'll say next about Preston. It isn't the relationship I spent 39 years wishing for, but it's an honest one, finally, and I've learned that honest is worth considerably more than easy. Preston and I had lunch a few months ago, the first time since the settlement was finalized, at his suggestion. It was awkward in the particular way that conversations between people who've hurt each other but still share a childhood tend to be. Long silences, careful subjects, the 2 of us circling around the actual thing without quite landing on it until near the end, when he finally said, "I think I spent so long being told I was the one who was going to carry this family forward that I never stopped to ask whether I actually deserved that, or whether I was just the one everyone decided to believe in without checking." I didn't have a tidy response to that. I just told him I hoped someday he'd build something of his own that he actually earned the credit for, because I meant it, even through everything else I still felt.
He's working now, I've heard through my mother, for a mid-sized logistics company 2 states away, starting somewhere near the bottom, the way I once did, the way he never had to before. I don't know if it will change him in any lasting way. I've stopped needing it to in order to feel like my own life is complete. There is a strange, quiet peace in finally releasing yourself from the job of managing someone else's growth, a job I don't think I ever consciously signed up for, but had been doing in some fashion since we were children. My mother and I talk more now than we ever did while my father was alive, sometimes about nothing in particular, a recipe she's trying, a book she's reading, small, ordinary things that would have felt impossible to share honestly a few years ago. She asked me recently whether I'd ever forgiven her fully for the way things had been. I told her I wasn't sure forgiveness was quite the right word for what was actually happening between us. It felt less like forgiveness and more like both of us finally agreeing to see each other clearly for the first time, decades later than either of us would have liked. I kept my father's old gray filing cabinet, the one he refused to replace for 30 years, moved now into my own office, empty of everything except a single framed copy of his letter, hung on the wall where I can see it every morning before the rest of the day gets its hooks into me. Some people would probably find that strange, keeping a monument to the worst discovery of my life somewhere I have to look at it daily. I find it grounding. It reminds me, on the days when old habits creep back in, the reflexive smallness, the instinct to let someone else's confidence take up more room than my own quiet competence, that someone once watched the whole, unglamorous, unremarkable-seeming shape of my working life and understood, long before I let myself believe it, that it deserved to finally be seen clearly, on paper, with my name where it had always actually belonged. If you've ever been the one who did the real work while somebody else collected the credit, the one who kept everything running from a desk with no title on the door, I hope you find your own version of that letter someday. Sometimes it doesn't arrive the way you expect, or as gently as you hope. Sometimes it takes a locked drawer and a small brass key, and someone who loved you enough to spend the last year of his life quietly making sure the truth would finally have somewhere to land. I think about that January conversation with my father often, the one about happiness, the one I didn't know how to answer honestly at the time. I think if he asked me again today, sitting in this office with his name on the wall and his old filing cabinet standing empty beside my desk, I think I would finally have a real answer ready for him, instead of the careful, deflecting one I gave him then. I think I would tell him that happiness, for me, turned out to be less about being celebrated and more about finally being accurately seen, by him in the end, and slowly, imperfectly, by the rest of the family who'd spent so long looking somewhere else. There's a photograph on my office wall now, one I found tucked in the back of that same gray filing cabinet. My father at maybe 35, standing in front of the original single-room workshop, sawdust on his shirt, squinting into the sun, laughing at something outside the frame, decades before any of this. I think about him at that age sometimes, before the company grew into something large enough to hide things inside of, before any of us existed to disappoint or surprise him. I wonder if he'd be proud of how it all turned out. I think somehow he already knew it might, or at least hoped it could. Not the specifics maybe, but the shape of it. A daughter finally allowed to stop shrinking into the space everyone else left for her. Some evenings, closing up the office long after everyone else has gone home, I still talk to him out loud, like I did in my car the night I finished his letter. I tell him about Marisol, about the 4th showroom, about the slow, imperfect repair happening between my mother and me. I like to imagine he'd approve, though knowing him, he'd probably also point out some small inefficiency in the new inventory system that still needed fixing, because comfort, in his mind, was never an excuse for neglecting the details. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know which part stayed with you the longest. And if you haven't yet, consider joining our little community here at Silent Victory Stories. We tell these stories because so many of you have lived versions of them yourselves, and there's something quietly powerful about knowing you're not the only one who was ever underestimated by the people who should have seen you first.